Our session today will feature one presentation only, and then we'll have a free discussion, and I do hope that we'll have a chance to take some questions from the room. And yesterday we also had two sessions here, and one housekeeping or technical comment. So we don't have an air conditioning unit here. We need to open windows if we want some air. If we don't do this, then we will not be able to comprehend our speakers properly. So for those people who are sitting next to the windows, please make sure that we air the room properly. So DNA of hidden champions. That may be a surprising title for a panel discussion. So while we're talking about hidden champions in particular, so let me tell you about where this phrase come from. So that phrase was mentioned by the German press in 1990, and Hermann Simon coined that phrase after publishing an article about small-time companies which actually were leaders in particular sectors of economy or were very close to the leading position. And those were low-profile companies. They didn't have high public exposure, and so hidden champions, that was the term coined by Hermann Simon, and we will be talking about these companies. Do we have them in Russia? What it takes to breed one champion of this kind. We have two companies who we decided to categorize as hidden champions. So where does Russia stand in comparison with other countries in terms of the hidden champions? What is the do we have the history of hidden champions? What is the history of entrepreneurship in Russia, and whether some entrepreneurial initiatives helped to spawn or originate some of these some companies of this kind? And I would like to start with giving the floor to Valery Fedorov, the General Director of All Russia Polling Center. They are doing a multiple of research, and just recently they have completed a research investigating the relations of the population in Russia to entrepreneurs. I think it's important for the purpose of understanding the context of these hidden champions. Valery, please, the floor is yours. Okay, thank you. So I understand the invisible hand of the market will be flipping through the sides. Okay, let's get started straight away. That research was completed in July 2017, and it was done within the framework so that research was carried out within the framework of our, let's say, daily phone poll. It's called the Tsiom Sputnik. We are calling to all groups from the Russian population. So we have that poll in 500 cities and towns and villages of the Russian Federation. So it's quite representative, and it's enough to understand the context for this discussion. So what do Russian people think about entrepreneurs and businessmen? And there are three parameters. The popularity, status, and income. Do Russian people want their children or grandchildren to become entrepreneurs? And we've given them 10 options to consider, and entrepreneurs did not make their way to the top 3 of the most wanted options, but it's the 4th most popular answer. 60% of people have nothing wrong with seeing their children or grandchildren being businessmen or entrepreneurs. So doctors are topping this survey. Engineers, that's quite a surprising answer, and public servants, 61%, and entrepreneurs and businessmen, 60%. So scientists, military people, teachers are less popular professions or less popular occupations. Income-wise, only 8% of people believe that entrepreneurs are getting low income. 80% believe that they stand okay in terms of the income, and status-wise. And we'll have a chance to ask this question to our participants today. So get ready. So only 10% of questioned people believe that entrepreneurs have low status, in low social status. A lot more people believe that they have higher status. So what do they think about business? So a small and medium business, and what do they think about big business? Because apparently there will be different answers. As far as SMEs are concerned, up to 90% of people said that they think well about small and medium business. 56% say that they like small and medium business or rather like it. Big business is in a more difficult situation, but it is not as bad as it was several years ago. 32 people think well about big business, and 35 think rather good. So there are more negative responses, but it's more or less in line with the benchmark. Only 28% mentioned that they treat or think negatively about big business. Big business is looked well upon by young people, so those people who the future belongs to. So 88% of youngsters said that they think well about big business. Also, those people who have relatively good income, they also respect big business, 75% in this group. At the other extreme side, we have elderly people above 60 years, and we have poor people. So only 40% from this group think well about big business, which is not a lot. So let's move on. Let's take a look at the change dynamics. Within recent 8 years, we can see these green lines creeping up. So this is the number of people who think well about private entrepreneurs, and red curves are going down. So I would say that's a move in the right direction. So trust. Do we trust businessmen or not? An interesting point to mention here is the fact that the share of those who are not trusting businessmen has been going down consistently within the last 5 years. In 2012, every second person was saying that they don't trust businessmen. In 2015, it was 43%, and this year it is 28%. So the share of those who do not trust businessmen reduced twofold. But there is another problem here. The business is getting less mistrust, but is not getting more trust. As far as trustworthiness of business is concerned, our businessmen are finding themselves in a twilight zone. So there is no reason to distrust businessmen, or at least there is a smaller number of these reasons, but at the same time people do not trust businessmen by default. So that's an area for big improvement. So people are not criticizing businessmen any longer, but they're not treating businessmen with trust. And trust is so that we can achieve a huge improvement here, as Andrew mentioned. So lots of things can be done here. So pensioners and poor people, old age pensioners and poor people do not trust businessmen. Let's move on. Let's take a look at how businessmen feel themselves here in Russia, and whether people want to become businessmen and want to start their business with regard to all factors which may matter. So the question was, would you like to become a private entrepreneur, and would you like to run your own business? So, we are showing the change dynamics for 27 years. Let's say 1991, 49% of those who we asked this question said that they don't want to run their own business, and only 29% said they would like to run their own business. I would not like to ponder over these fluctuations, but in 2017 we had the most recent data, and take a look. 22 people want to run their own business. We used to have 27 years ago, and 68 people don't want to have their own business, whereas before there were 49 of those. So after 30 years of getting deeper into the capitalist system and embracing the market trends, the share of those who would like to run their own business has gone down substantially. However, there are groups of population where people are more likely to start their businesses. So in the group aging from 18 to 24, 58% of people would like to start their own business, whereas on average it is just 22%. At the next age group, the likelihood of running their own business is going down significantly, down to 38%. And men are more likely to express their wish to run business as compared to women who don't want to do this. Those public servants and those who get salaries from the state, they are unlikely to start their own business. And old age pensioners, both who work and those who don't work, they believe that it's far too old for them to start their own company. So what is required to set up your own business? And those people who have their business already, those people who want to start their business, those people who wanted to but that desire is burned out, what do they need? They need capital, first and foremost. They need capital. This is what you need to start up your own company. So 24% mentioned 24% on average said they need capital. Among those who want to start their business, 48%. All other issues like taxation, state support, interest rate, a lot smaller share of people are mentioning these factors as significant. So money and capital is the only significant factor. And I would like to ask all our participants to comment on this. So what do you think about it? So people believe that the only thing they lack to start business is money or capital. Okay, let me put some more firewood into the fire. So not only we asked what people lack to start the business, we also asked the question, what do they think they need to become successful? So we asked them to point out 3 factors. So we asked entrepreneurs, we asked those who want to have their business, and we also asked those who don't want. So professional businessmen, professional entrepreneurs mentioned money. That's 43% of success depends on money. Then 26% mentioned the right team, or correctly built team. So 43% mentioned money, 26% mentioned correctly organized team, and talent, personal skills, entrepreneurial skills. That has something to do with DNA. So money has nothing to do with DNA for sure. A lot of people mentioned connections, 22%. Ability to produce good product or service, 26%. Luck, 20%. 20% of entrepreneurs believe that luck is an integral part of their success. Also faith and success. So those people who want to start their own business, they give different answers. 61% means money. 36% mentioned properly organized team. Interesting work. So not only you will start your own business to earn money and to go up the social ladder, but you would like to start your own business to do something meaningful for the society. For those who don't want to start their own companies, 52% mentioned that it is money, correctly organized team, and then 26% mentioned entrepreneurial skills and talents. Now let's talk about the difficulties faced by those people who start their businesses. Bureaucracy, administrative barriers, administrative pressure. These are the top options. Within 8 years, we started asking these questions in 2009, and the situation has barely changed as compared to 2009. We are trying to reduce administrative barriers, but there is a call for reducing them even more. Lack of initial capital, it was 27%, now only 18% of people are mentioning this. And that's interesting miscorrelation, because answers to previous questions mentioned solely money, and now we are talking about something else. So difficult economic situation like crisis, lack of consumer demand. That is being frequently mentioned as a difficulty faced by entrepreneurs. 13%, high taxes, 12%, and high competition, although our antitrust body does not believe in it. So 10%. 10% believe that competition is too high. Corruption was named by 7%. Lack of connection, 6%. So corruption is less important problem as compared to competition. Oh, that's delightful. And remember, I mentioned that there is a group of people who wants to start their business to create some value for the society, not for the purpose of enriching themselves. So the question is, do you think that Russian society benefits from what businessmen and entrepreneurs do, or that activity is harmful for the society? 22% believe that businessmen are creating value.
This pie chart, I'd like to repeat that 22% of the respondents believe that the operations of Russian businesses bring benefits to the society, and another 22% believe that they benefit somewhat. But people who believe that it's hurting the Russian society, the share of those respondents stands at only 16%. So, speaking about some special anti-entrepreneur moods in the Russian society, this would be a myth to believe. So at least that's how things stand today. Apparently our society generally treats businessmen fairly and even favorably. So what benefits do businessmen bring to the society? They create jobs, improve the job situation, so they pay taxes, they ensure that goods and services are accessible and varied. And without businesses, the development of our economy would be impossible, and the GDP won't grow. They create products. Businessmen reduce prices because of competition. Because the competition is no longer viewed as a hurdle, it's viewed as a good thing. Also, businessmen are engaged in charitable activities, and support arts. Who has the most positive influence on the life of the society? So we offered a choice to our respondents, and businessmen were in the top 3. Teachers and scientists took first 2 places, then 4th place was taken by bureaucrats, which is interesting, and businessmen, entrepreneurs, they had 3rd place. Well, they were in the top 3 anyway. And the military lag behind in this regard, and even the clergy people, clergymen, they were behind the businessmen. So businessmen bear a lot of responsibility for how things are in the society. Speaking about social prestige, entrepreneurs' prestige is rather high. People believe being an entrepreneur will bring you good material well-being, and you'll be respected by the society. Of course, there is some differentiation depending on the scale and the size of the businesses, and large businesses, they are big businessmen. They are no longer viewed as oligarchs or parasites on the body of the society. So this stage is already past us, and trust toward businessmen is not at too high a level. The share of those who want to become a businessman is not at record high levels, but it's still sufficient, 22 to 23%. Every fifth person, speaking about the younger generation, then more than half of young people want to become entrepreneurs. So we still have a long way to go, but that's the picture how things stand now. So we are now in the context, and the next 3 presenters, Mr. Movchan, Frank Schauf, and Sergei Medvedev, I would like you to comment on these findings, on this data from 3 different standpoints, because Andrei is an economist, a respected economist, a salient economist. Sergei is more like is in a better position to discuss the historic perspectives, the historic context of the deal. And my question to Frank would have to do with what do we look like against the background of the global picture, global experience in terms of how people view and treat businessmen and entrepreneurs. Andrei, you have the floor. Well, I would like, with your permission, to digress from the topic a little bit. I'd like to say a couple of words about the data itself, because I am a long-time entrepreneur. I've been a businessman for many years, and I would like to, and I have a lot of questions to the data. I do not see any benefits to poll, let's say, metallurgical industry workers, asking them if they want to marry Hollywood stars, because this poll, Hollywood actresses, they haven't seen steelmakers from Chelyabinsk, so you are too negative about the steelmakers' chances. I'm quite sure about what the result would be. So people are asked what they think about various topics, various things. So the questions are how things should be viewed rather than their personal view. So if you ask someone what would you like to be, it's a meaningless question, because I would like to be a scientist, I would like to be a teacher, a musician, but unfortunately I had to become an entrepreneur. So we need to look at those data that tell us what the reality is, how things actually stand. And here we can compare ourselves to the international stage. We know that in real terms, only 1/10 in terms of percentage point of people in Russia are engaged in businesses compared to other countries, and this share keeps shrinking. It's some statistical data that doesn't come from polls. It's the actual data. And if we look at the trust curve, I must say that I do not believe that these numbers give us a realistic picture who brings more benefits to our country. So bureaucrats, entrepreneurs, or scientists, that's because people give answers at random. But if we speak about the trust numbers, we can trust them, no pun intended. And trust is very low in the society to all systemic things, including education and so on. So whatever is non-systemic, then these people get more trust. So, like researchers, no one knows what they do, but they do not cause a lot of harm in the public eye. So, but in the Soviet Union, speaking about the entrepreneurs were frowned upon, but now it looks like deliberate efforts are made in order to form some mistrust toward businessmen. And Mr. Siluanov spoke here about an extension of the tax amnesty. They wanted to make things better. And this legalization scheme is well developed, and being a financial businessman myself, I can have an opinion that things were quite good. But whenever you give a privilege, wherever you put people who were not paying taxes in a privileged position, then you are destroying trust. And then this amnesty was extended. It's really destruction of trust in the society, because we demonstrated to our people that you'd better be gray, you'd better keep a low profile, never risk anything. And of course, a society where 22% trust businessmen and 80% of people want to be businessmen. So it's a society that is criminalizing itself because they do not trust what they want to be. So I think a lot depends on how we structure our society. It's clear, everybody knows that businessmen are very rich and it's good to be a businessman, but very few people understand what being a businessman actually means. And no one is helping people become businessmen, no one is developing the system. So these are non-economic factors that we need to consider. I'll stop here so as not to gobble up all the time in our session. So an interesting number I ran across the other day, and the number was that the trend is that in the United States over the recent 20 years the popularity of entrepreneurship dropped by half. So we see the United States as the cradle of entrepreneurship, but processes are underway in the US that give us results that are similar to Russia's results. So the numbers are similar. Between 20 and 25% of people want to become entrepreneurs, but 5 years ago this number stood at 40%. So maybe you would like to comment on these numbers. Well, in fact, I have already commented on them. Numbers do not matter. As like if you want to become a cloakroom attendant. So we know that 55% of America's GDP are created in small and medium-sized businesses. We know the shares of businessmen, the share of the GDP that's created by private businesses. So they cannot be compared to the Russian numbers, and the US share keeps growing, and the share of earnings that entrepreneurs have is growing. And the number of people willing to become businessmen is going down because maybe more people want to become actresses or space or astronauts, space travelers. So a lot depends on what people are doing. So unfortunately, we want people to do what they need to do rather than what they want to do or pursue their fancies. Well, I would agree with that. Sometimes individuals or even chunks of society can be misled or misguided in their desires, but there are certain cliches in this society based on which people assume this train of thought or another. But let us, I'm encouraging the panelists to offer another view. I'd like Sergei Medvedev to talk about historical prerequisites for the current treatment of entrepreneurs in society. First of all, I would like to apologize for being late. Climatic factors have interfered, and I spent more time on the way. So I was rather intrigued by the title of this section because it sounded somewhat biological, DNA of businesses, so like something incorporated deep into the national culture. If we look at the very concept of DNA, I'd like to recall a joke when the Armenian radio asked whether we can build socialism along in compliance with the Swedish model. The answer was yes, we can, but where are we going to get so many Swedes? So if we look at Marx Weber's writings and the Protestantism and how this worldview helped them arrive at capitalism, especially pure in the United States, of course, there are certain cultural traits. Let me add my 2 cents. In China, there's a lot of people who want to Confucius in China, well, in spite of my respect to Confucius' side, it has been proved many times over that the Protestant myths about capitalism are not true. We have been talking about them for 100 years, but we are trying to learn things about the DNA of capitalism rather than DNA of Mr. Weber. But if we are talking about, let's talk about Russia and Russian DNA. If we look at our culture, the image of an entrepreneur is rather sad. We do not Forsyth Saga, we do not Theodore Dreiser and his characters. Our entrepreneurs are Chichikov, who was a archetypal entrepreneur, or Ostap Bender, that were depicted as some sort of scammers or frauds or cheaters. So they are not active. They do not do anything useful, at least, and they're in a position with the true image of an entrepreneur. Or take Oblomov. They are the antonyms to entrepreneurs as they are depicted in the Western literature. Our entrepreneurs at best assume a Buddhist attitude toward the world. They reject any active agency in the world. And even if we take Russian fairy tales, unlike a large body of European, or let's say German body of fairy tales about, tailors or smiths, our heroes are rather passive. They are waiting for fate to give them a magical fish that will just grant them all their desires, and they'll be lying down on a warm bench. So our national culture appears to reject active entrepreneurship as a concept, but of course culture has nothing to do with what we have now. Institutions have a lot to do with how we structure our space, our social fabric today. In pursuit of communism, we've been engaged in all sorts of activities and debts for thousands of years. We can discuss the weather, we can discuss many economic activities that we have been able to succeed in this hostile environment while our ancestors lived in these snowy lands in an unfavorable climate. The risks involved in any economic activity here are disproportionately high in our climate. So the type of activity that had taken shape here even before the Mongols came had to do with minimizing climatic risks. So the risks and the low fertility of the soil, to say nothing. I'm not speaking about what was going on in the steppes south of the forest belt, which is now referred to as Ukraine. Ukrainian culture seems to be somewhat different from the Russian culture because of that. Poor climate, a very short vegetation period, a very poor geopolitical environment. In the south, you have the steppe. From the north, you're attacked by the Vikings. So in this kind of conditions, you create an economy that many economists describe as collectivization, socialization, and creating communes in order to distribute the risks, to spread them more evenly between members of society. So the idea of private property is rather weak. Personal sovereignty, this concept is rather weak. So we tend to delegate these authorities to higher-ups, to our princes, that turn into Caesars, to emperors, and so on. So all these things had been there even before the Mongol invasion. I think that these economic theories are quite correct in describing our realities, our approaches to forming our societal life, and the theories describing ownership and state power, authority. So we can recall, I apologize, Max Weber and Karl Marx also wrote about the Asian way of production. It was more than 100 years ago, and our philosopher Berdyaev also spoke about Russian mentality. We can recall the discussion between Minister Stolypin and Leo Tolstoy. They exchanged quite a lot of letters, and Tolstoy insisted that the Russian peasant rejects the most unfair type of property, that's private property. Those redistribution institutions, they come into being under the auspices of the state in order to minimize to minimize private initiative and to minimize rent-seeking activities. So, but those things are at the root of European and U.S. capitalisms, and now it's at the root of the global imperialism. Today, this distributive economy turned into the economy of the pipe, where we are getting rent from selling our national mineral resources. So last year, the American economist William Powell passed away. He used to say that in each society, the number of entrepreneurs and the level of entrepreneurial initiative, the DNA of entrepreneurship is the same in all societies, but entrepreneurship can be broken into two parts: innovative entrepreneurship, productive entrepreneurship, and destructive entrepreneurship. So the last case is where we redistribute social wealth. So why so many social benefits accrue to the U.S. businesses? Why they are responsible for such a share of the GDP and Germany? Because most of entrepreneurs are involved in innovative entrepreneurship, innovative businesses. But in our case, this pyramid is overturned. It's put on its summit. A lot of people are engaged in non-productive entrepreneurship and even in destructive entrepreneurship, which is our forced agencies are guilty of. So why do we have such a culture of force? Why do we have such a lot of transactional costs for the black cars, for SUVs? Because the force is a very important factor in running businesses here without creating any social benefits. They are only about the redistribution.
And talking about redistribution, we're getting back to the model of the Russian state, which originated in the eastern part of Eurasian continent. First we had a community there, then that community chose a varag to run its community, then there was a Mongol Khan, then the Russian Tsar who was running this community, and the main task of that Tsar was the redistribution of benefits. So and that's exactly what it is about now. I think it's all about institutions. I think it's all about a particular type of economic activities. It's about, let's say, the environmental imperative or reason for being of the Russian Federation. It's not about particular people. Like people with the Soviet passports or Russian passports, when they find themselves in different conditions, they are capable of setting up great businesses, and we could see this before. And the same thing is happening here. Those people who stay here in this room now, they are fully capable of running innovative businesses rather than non-productive or destructive businesses, but their share is very, very small, and that's confirmed by statistics, and that was also confirmed by Andrei in his talk. So I don't think that we should be talking about DNA of people. We should rather be talking about social institutions and particular conditions which are determined by geopolitical and climatic and historic factors. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Sergei, thank you. And I have one question to ask you. I understand why institutions have such a great impact upon business environment, but those factors which you mentioned, they are not directly related to institutions. You are linking this to environment, climate, traditions. Well, traditions have something to do with social institutions, but to what extent do you think we depend on these factors which are beyond our control? Putting this discussion into the context of development of entrepreneurship in Russia, I think that it can work as explanation of existing situation, but that model lacks predictive capability, because the history of human civilization was about diminishing the deterministic factors of environment and geography. So we know how institutions can be planted into different climatic areas, like we have, let's say, Asian type of capitalism, for example, and we have countries which have even less welcoming climate, but they have well-developed business, like the countries of Northern Europe, for example. I think that Russia faces a different challenge. It's not so much about referring all the time to difficult climate or to the serfdom or history of serfdom. I think it's more straightforward. We need more political will. We need leadership who will play along in line with particular rules. Those rules need to be transparent, and they need to be set right. We need to have transparent institutions. So a number of entrepreneurs in Russia, there is a similar number in the United States and Singapore, and if we have the right conditions here, these entrepreneurs will start to work in constructive rather than destructive way. Okay. So we have a foreigner here on our panel. He's a German, but before giving the floor to him, I would like to give Andrei a chance to respond. Well, actually, Sergei has made my comment. It's common wisdom that social institutions and state institutions should compensate for the impact of factors beyond our control, like bad climate. In Canada, you have bad climate. China also has a history of serfdom and troubled and volatile history. Greece has undergone the same period. If you have working institutions, they can offset the effect of the factors which are beyond control. But if the institutions are not working, you resort to referencing to the climatic conditions. It's not a kind of a Russian curse. I'm just telling you why we had to go through this, but that's exactly the purpose of our panel discussion here, and that's why we have politics. Politics help people change their circumstances, and that will be probably my final comment. Anthropologists believe that there are two types of nations, or two types of ethnical, let's say, groups: those who adapt to circumstances and those who change the circumstances. In Russia, we have lots of ways to change ourselves, to adapt, like drinking, watching TV, or getting involved in social activities. So people, in our case, frequently change themselves in order to avoid changing circumstances. But then again, I would like to say that determinism is not the only concept to explain what we have. Since we have mentioned Marx, Weber, and Protestant ethics, I wanted to throw a new topic into the discussion, the Catholic Renaissance, and probably Frank will talk about it also. It's an example when changes took place almost as we spoke. In 1990, prosperity and economic growth were displayed by purely Catholic countries like Poland, southern Germany, and Ireland. And so several researchers came up with an idea that it was mostly driven by an event which happened a generation before, in 1972, when Roman Catholic Church released an important document in which it reviewed its relation to three important phenomena of values, like poverty, because for a long time Catholic Church was praising poverty and regarded this as one of the virtues, and prosperity. Catholic Church always regarded prosperity as something which is related to criminal activity. They looked down on prosperity. And labor. Catholic priests believed that people have to work because before they violated the rules of the Adam, of the paradise, they have been expelled from the paradise and now they had to work. So these changes finally resulted in the fact that finally resulted in economic growth, though I think there is a lot of similarity. So it was the Second Vatican Convention, which completed in 1970s, in the 60s actually, because the document was released in 1972, but the review took place before. Frank, please, the floor is yours.
I can start perhaps my intervention before I come to the topic of our discussion again, with some confessions. First, I'm happy that we start a history debate because I'm a historian by education. Second, I'm Catholic, and therefore
I didn't know. I just
now I confess. But you know, I also want to make some remark on this question of Protestantism. I think because you said that it doesn't play any role. It plays a role. Certainly it plays a role. It's a historical fact. I mean, I can tell you one very practical example. I'm coming from the most Catholic area in Germany, lying between Cologne and the Belgian border. Okay? Traditionally, historically, the population is more than 90% Catholic. Starting from the 19th century, when the industrialization of Germany started in that region, all the entrepreneurs are Protestants. They're Calvinists. They're not Catholics. Catholicism versus Protestantism, this question, it plays a role. It plays a role. Now, I would say that, let's say, in the confrontation, especially of German Catholics with German Protestants, the Catholics have become more and more Protestant, which might also express itself into this, what you have said, with regards to the change in Catholicism over time. But certainly Protestantism plays a role. I mean, it's a historical fact. It's not just, let's say, something which somebody...
You mean as an example?
Yes. Yes. And second point is, certainly when I look into your figures, okay, at that time, certainly sociological surveys did not exist, but it remembers me a little bit, let's say, on the situation. I'm just reading a book on the sociological or social development of the early modern times. I would also assume that then the entrepreneurs were seen as a damaging class rather than a useful class. So it seems to be something which is normal in a period when, let's say, the entrepreneurial the entrepreneurial activity is becoming stronger and certifies itself during the following decades and centuries perhaps, and also where, let's say, the entrepreneurs are not necessarily always playing in accordance to the game rules of the game of the given society, which also certainly plays a role. Now, let's come to that topic, because I also can confess that I had the privilege of having discussions with Professor Hermann Simon privately on this question, and certainly this is a very important concept, and it says a lot certainly about the things that you have said. It says a lot about institutions, it says a lot about, let's say, the development of a given economy. And if you, for example, look into some economies which are globally speaking very successful, let's take the German economy, but you can also take the Scandinavian ones, you can take also most probably the American, also the Canadian one as examples, then certainly this category of companies plays a pretty important role in the society. I mean, if we talk about Germany, most of you would think about Siemens, Volkswagen, Bosch, Mercedes, but in reality, certainly the large bulk of the German GDP is manufactured by medium-sized companies. And a lot of these medium-sized companies, and here we come to the hidden champions, are highly innovative. They are not producing, let's say, sexy products like Mercedes cars or something like this, but they're usually producing B2B goods. So they only sell it, let's say, into the business to other businesses. And this certainly is, let's say, something which is a very important segment in the, for example, German society, in the German economy. They are small entities mostly, it's very important. So I think it is wrong to look mostly at the large monsters, either of the Russian or of the German or whatsoever economy. Second, again, they are selling mostly to other businesses, so they're B2B companies, so they're not so, let's say, publicly known. Third, they are strongly working along the line of innovation. So they have an innovation and they are continuing to improve it all the time. So this is certainly very important with regards to these companies, and they're geared toward competition. And they're geared toward competition, and they have reached, generally, therefore the hidden champions, they have reached, let's say, a market-leading position in a certain market globally. This means that they are, let's say, number one, number two, number three, perhaps, of a given market segment. And this can be very exotic segments, for example, of the machine building sector. For example, it was some weeks ago, some months ago, I had a chance here to talk on Inoprom with a German machine building company from the southwest, which is producing only 2 or 3 dozens of machines, very specified machines, but they're the market leader in that given market segment globally. Yeah, and this is certainly something which you have to keep in mind. Then they have a long-term orientation, so they are not, let's say, a finance investment. They're not buying that company and then selling it again after 5 years, but they have a long-term orientation. This long-term orientation is very often linked to the fact that they are family-owned and family-owned over generations. I mean, I've just on my mind the example of a Germany, but is nowadays a rather big company of the German company Merck, which is 350 years old now, and it's always in the ownership of the same family over generations. So this is certainly something which
Knauf, very, very good example. Knauf,
yeah, Knauf is not that old, but it's also a family-owned business, which I assume, if you would look into the turnover, is bigger here nowadays in Russia than in Germany. So, and certainly they are one of these examples. Yes, I can also give some other examples. But what is very important here is, let's say, if we talk about DNA and then we, let's say, go along the line of social Darwinism, so what is certainly very important for the development of the DNA of these companies is that, let's say, there is already long-term, I'm not talking about the last 5 or 50 years, I'm talking about the last, let's say, 200, 300 years, you have certainly something which is very important, or several factors which are very important. Finances, we talked about this earlier. financing is certainly an extremely important thing for medium-sized companies, because you have to have a proper banking system which gives you a credit, a long-term credit, and in the Western understanding, a long-term credit is 25 years, which gives you a long-term credit for a low interest rate, and which will also, let's say, keep a working relationship with that company. Then you certainly need to have an open market. You have to have these companies. They are used over decades, sometimes even, let's say, over centuries, to competition. And here certainly, I mean, the German history is not so easy either, but certainly, and also the European history generally, but what you have in Europe already for a long time, even before the European community, even in spite of the two world wars, which mainly took place in Europe, you have open markets. You have open markets, and competition plays a role. And competition, again, is not seen as a negative factor, but it's seen as a factor which is positive in order to enhance development. You have to have a good university system, because you obviously have to have good engineers or people who know chemistry and physics, and you have to have a rational behavior of an administration. So things like corruption, things like arbitrary behavior of administrations are certainly more or less under control. And this is an ecosystem which you have to have, not, as I said, for 5 years or for 15 years, but you have to have it for decades, or it has to develop at least into the right direction. And this happens, let's say, if I may come back to this Protestantism thing, this, in fact, if you look at the development of the world economy long-term, last 500 years, I mean, in the end, the most successful countries seem to be the Protestant ones. I mean, I see that certainly in Asia you have changes in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but in the long run, I mean, it's the Protestant countries who have been, let's say, the world leaders in the drivers of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Does it mean that you think that the institutions, economic and social institutions, are the main reason and precondition for hidden champion just to appear?
Yes, most probably, yes. Yes, so I agree very much with what was said, that institutions play a role. But institutions, what are institutions? I mean, institutions are not, let's say, bureaucracy, let's say, finance administration, finance administration or whatsoever, but it's also behavior. Behavior is also, let's say, in the theory taken as an institution. And this is something which develops not from one day to the other, but it's a long-term development. And I think if you look into the Russian discussion, or if I look into the Russian discussion, my impression is always that you're expecting changes very quickly into the right direction. But I think it's certainly also, if you look into the Western history, it's a long-term development, and it's certainly a long-term development which has to do that you have clashes of interests, you have interests which are, let's say, being fought out in society, and then which lead in the end in the compromise to some institutions which then also hold for a certain time.
Спасибо.
Well, thank you very much. By the way, I have some personal experience here. For some time I've been involved with German companies a lot, even including small companies, and what amazed me when we started talking about business, they always positioned themselves on the European scale, at least, but in most cases on a global scale. So companies whose names I had never heard, they were operating with such categories, because whenever we talk with Russian companies, they say in our region we are number 2. So they do not. So this is something that exists on the level of DNA. So they haven't opened up to the world, to the global environment yet. They believe that it's sufficient to put them in a hierarchy within a region in Russia. So it indeed does take time for them to change their thinking.
When you think about perhaps German or whatsoever entrepreneurs, you would think about the CEO of Siemens or the CEO of Volkswagen, who speak 5 languages, have 3 doctorate degrees and whatsoever. But this is not the normal German entrepreneur. I mean, not to say it clearly, when you sit together with one of these hidden champion guys, I had this chance once in a while. They're really, I mean, they're behaving in a very provincial manner. Yeah. But they're really great in, let's say, their given business, and they're exporting, let's say, the larger part of their goods. But when you're sitting with these guys, you cannot imagine that they're the global leader in their given segment.
Вот это и поражает, что ты встречаешься с этой компанией.
That's exactly what's amazing. So you would meet with such a company at a small town, the name of which you wouldn't have heard before, but then they'd be home for a global operation. So the next two speakers are entrepreneurs Alexander Alberovich and Evgeny Demin. I must apologize that you've been compared to Mr. Chichikov, our beloved literary character, but so you'll need to refute this comparison and maybe assert that you are better compared with the Protestants. So it wasn't by accident that we chose you for this session. Part of the reason is that you work on international markets, and I've had a chance to visit Evgeny Demin at the brainstorm session, and Evgeny is head of Splat, and the people from Turkey and China were there, and they are huge markets, and I'd like you to discuss that. How did it happen that you had to go out to international markets? Why were Russian markets not sufficient? What happened to your DNA that you started to turn into a hidden champion? Please, you have the floor. I'm involved in a publishing house that publishes literature for kids, for children, and I've been in this business, and the name of the publishing house is Clover, for you to remember. So last year now, we registered a subsidiary in the US, and this year on the 10th of January we set up an office in the US, and now we are deploying ourselves in a serious way in the US. We are one of the first Russian publishers who publishes literature in Russian on an international scale. That's a description of my business. So we did look at quite simple things, and I don't think that we've done anything overcomplicated or that we've been too sophisticated in our judgment of what's going on international markets. So market number one is the US, speaking publishers, and the Chinese market is number two in terms of its size for children's literature. Well, please turn on the air conditioner, open the window. The US, the Chinese, and the German markets, after taking a look at them, it became clear to us that we'd better start off in the US, and then we could take steps in order to get some results. I think that during our Q&A session I can provide you with more details, but now I'd like to say a few rather general high-level things about what I felt. I don't have any research experience. I've never been involved in science and research, unfortunately, so I do not study what's going on. My experience is purely empirical, and my conclusions are based on empirical perceptions. So in the United States there is and this is something that our German colleague commented on. So there's a totally different ways that people communicate with each other, and the different way that they treat each other. And as entrepreneur, thank God, our state, our government, the Russian government never interfered with my operations. They didn't help me much, but they have never been in my way. So my colleagues, other entrepreneurs who would not let me sell my books in chain stores, in chain bookstores that would not grant me favorable terms in their contract. So that would do things, my colleagues and other entrepreneurs, they would do things that cannot be imagined happening in the US. You know, when a huge bookseller, the largest bookseller in online store, can within a day or within an hour declare that they stop accepting goods in their warehouses before the new year, and they have 2 weeks to go. So it's really difficult. How can you figure out what you are going to do? And no one would pick up their phone. You don't have anyone to talk with. It's our corporate rule. So go away, do your thing. So the environment here is quite aggressive. When people are not helpful to each other, people won't open up to other people, won't do anything useful to other people, although those things do not affect their lives in any negative way. So I think institutional things need to be accomplished when we as a nation look inside ourselves. And now I was happy to hear that attitudes toward entrepreneurs have started to change, and I hope that within the entrepreneurial circles attitudes will start to change when we decide to become more helpful toward each other. That would be great. When we went off to the US market and there was a huge exhibition that dealt with the topic of cooperation between entrepreneurs. The size of the market was $30 billion, and half of the market were independent book sellers. And just imagine, we are a publishing house from Russia. There are dozens of them in Russia right now, so we are not number one. So we just wrote letters to 5 managers of huge publishers: Simon Schuster, HarperCollins, Random House, Penguin. We wrote to them and told them that we wanted a meeting with them and to discuss distribution in the United States. No one said no. They all made appointments with us, and I've always been saying that when I opened my publishing house, and out of large Russian publishers, just one person met with me to discuss the topic of selling my books in his bookstores. Other people said, well, maybe next time, when you are tired of playing your silly games, then we'll find something for you to do. So, of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this environment and what's going on there is the big difference between. Well, let's cut straight down to the root. So, is this a consequence of underdeveloped competitive environment, because of lack of a competitive environment? Well, let me tell you. When I was driving here, the guard at the entrance, what does he ask of you? Or a guard at the door of any office. Where are you going and who are you going to see? Well, that's the questions they ask, and we are quite used to it. What do they ask you in the United States? Can I help you? How can I help you? So it's a set phrase. It doesn't mean much. Maybe something got lost in translation. No, this is part of the DNA. It's the difference in the cultural code, because these questions are quite different culturally, and this is where the difference lies in the story of entrepreneurs. When you go to an organization, they say, where are you going? And in the US, they'll ask you, how can I help you? So it's a minor detail, but it's significant. It's meaningful. Thinking about how we should be thinking about international markets, I think we need to be thinking like they do. the way they do. We need to try and understand that there are cultural traits, cultural features, but we need to take the best of them and adopt the best of them as part of our daily practices. I've looked at a movie that's quite popular now when our basketball team learned to play with the US team. So they were writing down what cool tricks the other team uses, and that's what we do. I mean, you don't need to reinvent the bicycle time and again. You should not assume that you have some unique techniques or experiences that will give you a lot of edge at the other market. So useful things should be just copied. We need to be copycats in a sense. So as an entrepreneur, I believe that good luck plays a huge role. Forget about money and all else. So when you get lucky, you get lucky. And the role of luck is underestimated. Psychologists and Daniel Coleman, who writes about these things, guys, you can repeat everything, but you disregard the good luck factor that plays a disproportionate role in many cases. But optimism is a very important trait for an entrepreneur. You need to believe that things will turn out well. It's good on the one hand, but on the other hand, it makes you keep your eyes closed to the risks you may run into. And the risks can be huge. I can understand people who do not want to become entrepreneurs because the risk of failure is many times the possibility of success, the probability of success. Well, Evgeny Dyomin, he is such a handsome guy, and I am too. So we are good visual examples. So it's a nice pause. It's a nice turn in the conversation. So we are good illustrations of how good it is to be an entrepreneur, but we haven't brought here people from the cemetery. Those people who went broke, who lost their fortunes, and a lot of horrible things came their way. So my answer wasn't properly organized, but that's the thoughts I wanted to share with you. This germ of going global, is it still in you? I mean, you are in the US already. Do you want to go elsewhere? Yes, Spanish-speaking countries. So we are looking at the size of those markets. Of course, speaking about the English-speaking world, well, there are differences between American English and British English, but we have hundreds of millions of English-speaking people, even in Nigeria, and so on. So Nigeria is a huge market, and it's growing, it's developing. So for an African country, there are wonderful opportunities there. Thank you. Well, now I'd like to turn it over to Evgeny. As Alexander said, he is a handsome guy. So Evgeny, your turn. Well, let's continue our anthropological conference. I'll tell you a good story, how good entrepreneurs and Neanderthals were, and how you can, looking at their bones, say how good the GDP is going to be the next year. So I'll be quite serious in my treatment of the thoughts that we have shared so far. I believe that our greatest difficulty is, considering our history, is somewhat different from what we discussed. The difficulty is that we've been setting our goals for the future based on what we had in the past. Like last year, our harvest was this, then next year we should get more, but we need a better understanding of the difficulties that we are likely to run in. So if our GDP has grown by 1.7% and the global GDP grew by 3%, it means that we are losing our share in the global GDP. So we should not be looking in the rear view mirror, but we need to look at the role we want to play in the world of tomorrow, and this will help us understand what we need to change in our current systems in order to get there, to attain our goals. So this is my position. I understand understand that I underestimate the risks involved. Speaking about the DNA, which is the topic of our session, what I'd like to share with you is that we did try to analyze ourselves in a detailed way as a company, as a team, and considering that we operate in 67 countries right now, so in addition to our Russian office, we have 10 non-Russian offices, and we ran surveys there in considering the companies that our German colleague referred to. So we were able to identify, to pinpoint rather features that we share with international companies, so such as long-term financial goals, and those companies that for a long time have been effective. The second thing would be focusing on our own competencies. Those companies understand where they can become the best in the world and which grounds they should never step into because they're not good for doing there. Another thing was mentioned by Andrei. It's feeling global, being global, but more importantly, feeling global. Is it a psychological factor or something that has to be in your head, or do you need any outside conditions? Well, I think you should put this question to sociologists and the people who study such things, but I believe that internal goal setting is important, and this can be trained and inculcated. But a simple analysis shows that Russia accounts for less than 2% of solvent demand. So if you start doing something ambitious, then you only want to work in Russia, then you are talking about less than 2% of the global market. And the companies who see themselves as regional champions, they need to rise to higher levels, such as at least national level or international level. You know, about 40% on average of small and medium-sized businesses, what they do, they import things in Turkey, 30% export. But here, Russia exports about 1,000 items or line items, but China exports 50,000 line items. So we need to ask ourselves where we want to be in the future. So this question has both its domestic side, domestic dimension, and international dimension. And here I refer us to our historic experience 70 years ago, before the revolution. We had a 70-year period when Russian entrepreneurs were selling their goods to Europe very successfully, such as Mr. Demidov in metallurgy, and we sold our butter on the global market. And the 70 years that occurred after the revolution, I mean, they kind of purged the country of entrepreneurs, of people with initiative. So another factor is that we believe is important is our openness to the society at large. So if we are transparent and if we believe that the society is us, so when we're trying to teach somebody something, so just we are saying openly that we are going to do these things this way. So these four principles have helped our company to grow and become a sectoral champion. Thank you, Evgeny. We are getting close to giving the floor to the remaining two panelists who can affect the emergence of hidden champions, and I'm speaking about Kirill Khayan and Elena Bondarenko, who's in charge of the Practicum program, and it's a very interesting initiative from the Skolkovo School of Management. So my first question goes to Kirill. Kirill needs a microphone.
Здесь есть. Кирилл, здесь.
So, Kirill, how can you affect the appearance of these national champions? Where is this magic pill which can help change mentality and institutions, and How can you get inspiration? Well, Skolkovo is the, let's say, biggest hub which spawns these businesses, which are mentioned by Sergei, the high-tech businesses, constructive, innovation-oriented business. And currently our fund supports more than 1,700 companies which originated in recent 5 years. And this, let's say, psychological conflict of generations, and there's conflict between different positions people take in their lives. We see the manifestation of this conflict on a daily basis. So what we are doing now, we look for people with the mindset that we need. We look for people with the skills we need. And good entrepreneurs come from, let's say, mature people and scientists, and what we are trying to make them think that they can capitalize on their knowledge and they can lead businesses. And it's not an easy task to resolve. And not only here in Russia. In successful economies like United States of America, billions of dollars are being spent to make sure that research teams are converted into something who can work in the market. Well, is it a state task or it's a governmental task? And where is the fine line between the state institution and something where the state should not meddle in? That's a great question. About 10% of scientists are capable of running their own companies. Remaining 90% become part of teams. When I say make part, build teams out of them, so we pair them with business-focused people who help them to run business and help them to overcome these internal conflicts. So what do we need to have in place to make sure entrepreneurs are successful? You need DNA. You need a cultural code. That cultural code may be inherited. So that cultural code is different for different social groups. And then we also mention entrepreneurial skills. Somebody get these skills developed empirically. Somebody get them trained specifically. So to change the mindset of people, to build the right team, is partially the role of the state. And let me explain you why. If we mention just hard skills are the competences an entrepreneur should develop himself or herself. But culture-wise, the cycle is so long. So if we wait for organic change within the framework of this cycle, then we will lose momentum, because there are successful economies and there are far less successful economies which are focused on producing oil, and they are less focused on constructive entrepreneurship. And this is what we have in well-developed economies. Supporting this cultural code or supporting particular social groups is the role of the state, and this is effectively what we do, and we are funded by the state. And talking about hidden champions, and 2% of the market, of the world market, belonging to Russian companies. It's not so much about the market share, and it's not so much about the percentage of markets held by the Russian Federation, because in some markets we definitely have more than 2%. But it's more about market access. And here institutions step in, they play a very heavy role. Our role as Skolkovo is to simplify access to the market. I'll give you an example. Oil and gas sector is one of the biggest in the Russian economy, and it definitely accounts for more than 2% of the world volume. We have companies which, let's say, currently, regardless of the fact that oil and gas revenues make a huge part of Russian budget, we have companies who have larger overseas revenue than domestic revenue. So that tells you something about innovation. For example, Rof Oleon Dynamics, This is the company which builds models of oil fields and gas fields. There are also sorts of other examples, like readers. They build systems for robotized systems for training surgeons. Their revenue last year was $50 million, and their overseas revenue will definitely be higher than their domestic revenue here in Russia. So a matter of institutions is clearly very important, and there are two aspects of this. Institutions can help to achieve the long-term change of the cultural code, and the cultural code was set by the low population density, by the period of Soviet history, by the Tatar invasion, by the Varags. So this is something which can be done by the state. But the second point is it's not so much related to trust we have to businessmen, but it's more related to the economic structure, and it is exactly about finding an easier access to the market, and this is where a state can help. Okay, thank you, Kirill, and I'd like to give floor to Elena. Frequently, in different situations, we hear questions like, is it possible for champions and geniuses to, do you need to be born a genius, or can you become one? And the same question can be asked about companies. Those companies which you train, those companies which you train to operate in foreign markets, how did you come to this idea? How would you estimate this size? What do you think is the size of your customer base? How many people do you think would like to get trained and educated on this subject? Indeed, we have just recently embarked on a new program on developing Russian companies, and we faced the first challenge. We are talking exports normally. So our language is a bit crumbled, I would say, and it is a heritage of our previous economic times. So when we talk about global competition and competitive products and business models, because we, together with our training program, we're also researching existing business cases. So, and the answers we get is about the volumes which is being shipped and the volumes which is being sold. And here is what differentiates us from the global champions, because the day before we had a meeting with a couple of these champions, and they told us about clustering their businesses and the value chain. So we have yet to get there. There is this mental gap. We need to travel more. We need to see more things. We need to have a very clear picture of the future in our head, and we need to have faith in this future. So these champions are focusing on creating globally competitive product. That's the starting point. The next stage is business model, and entrepreneurs should think business models. And a success cannot just be copied and pasted from one environment into another environment. So, and the third point I'd like to make, thank you for your comment regarding supporting our foundation. It's without understanding the context, it is almost impossible to operate in international markets, because there are factors like our connections, there are factors like peculiarities of certain markets. So it would be good that if our businessmen would have more support which will help them prevail in foreign markets. But hidden champions, that's an interesting situation that we see. Every now and again, a new concept emerges in the world, and that concept describes the type of success, economic success. This hidden champion is the concept of the 90s of the previous century, and it describes German companies which combined deep competence and institutional support they got, and this is what brought them global. There are different There are other companies like Japanese companies, and their success is built on technological solutions plus clear-cut organizations. Fast gazelles, for example, fast-growing businesses. And so we witness a very interesting economic process. Property as an institution is almost 20 years old in our country. So, and now we also see the process of handing over businesses to third generation. And we are witnessing emerging companies which can embody our culture. Because we ask ourselves a question, what Russian business model is about? Does it exist at all? And what kind of companies are we building? What is the business pattern? How much time does it take to build a company? Be it a hidden champion, a national champion, if a champion at all. So how many unique companies were founded due to our unique competences? That's a big question now. And so we are living through very interesting times. And Elena, I'd like to ask you a small question. Let's say you have two models. We have Mr. Alperovich here and we have Evgeny here. They're, well, we're not sitting, we're participating. Yes, excuse me for misusing the word. Yes, you are participating in this discussion, and knock on wood. So, what do you think we need to train an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur who still speaks Soviet language. So, what do these entrepreneurs need hard skills, or rather they need soft skills? They need to know better ways around people. So, or do we just need to inspire them? Do we need to give them faith into what they are doing? Do we need to make them believe the world is way bigger than the country? You should have filled me in on this question, but anyway, experience and all other factors are important considerations. But the key thing is mentality. Because the key barrier which we always face is the way we think about business, is the way we create the vision of future. There is no pattern for entrepreneurship. They're all different, they're all great people. So we are providing them with tools. We're giving them tools. We're educating them about best practices related to, let's say, customs, legal side of things, making contracts. We are providing them with competences. We're teaching them how to build models. We are teaching them how to command resources. Because entrepreneurship is about a completely different pattern of gathering resources. You don't need ready available resources. You don't have access to international resources since they're very costly. That's what we learn people to do. That's what we teach people to do, and that's our test ground for piloting new businesses. Just let me run a brief advertisement first. Exporting processed products and exporting raw materials is the key thing for us. But so yes, hard skills are required to do the minimum in your job. But there are other organizations which provide state support, like for example, we have a joint program with another foundation which is focusing on promoting technological Russian companies in the world markets. But our discussion did not mention that quite a lot of money is being spent on entrepreneurial support. In every region and in every big city, we have a department for supporting small and medium businesses. So there are lots of institutions which are supposed to support business. But apart from financial support, I think we need to ensure change in social mentality, because our mass media keeps picking stories related to entrepreneurship, and they keep showing businessmen in negative context. Of course, these stories are there, but mass media is not coming up with a bigger number of positive stories. Of course, journalists and reporters are focused on catchy stories which can improve their circulation. But if we talk about changing mentality, and if we talk about changing our cultural code, we need to think about setting up communication channels which will report success stories. Kirill, thank you very much. So we have completed a round, and now we have 19 minutes for taking your questions. Valery from Sky & Company. My question is to Sergei Medvedev. I got stuck in a traffic jam today, and I was thinking about our cultural code. So my question is this. So you keep thinking about it in traffic jams, do you? So before, Russian people lived in harmony with the world and nature. So they tend to take a rest in winter, and they tend to work hard in summer. But the situation changed completely. Now in winter we are trying to work, and in summer we are taking rest. So what has happened? What do you think has happened? What was this change in our cultural code? I think it was determined by the switch from agricultural model to industrial model, because agricultural model is determined by the climate and it has a seasonal effect. And also it's about globalization trends and improved means of communication. You have more opportunities to go to the seaside now. But that's actually a very good question, with a lot of implications. So to what extent Russian civilization lives in harmony with surrounding nature? And I've got lots of, let's say, very sad examples. But actually, I wanted to ask a question. Did you ever try to work in summer as well? Okay, one more brief question. We are now working in winter because we used to take rest in winter before, and because current civilization demands that we have more and more educated people, and so there was educational cycle which was linked to agricultural cycle. So now you have more opportunities to work, you have better means of transportation, you can commute easier, and this is why you have better opportunities for education. And my question relates to the starting point of this discussion. And Mr. Fedorov mentioned that everything is fine, and our people like businessmen. And Mr. Movchan has painted a completely different picture. And I've been witnessing this, let's say, political schizophrenia for these 3 days, and because Mr. Manturov during the first session mentioned sanctions, saying that sanctions are invented by the West, and Mrs. Nabiulina was saying that everything is fine, but the community does not believe that Russia is out of the crisis. And as a representative of the business community, I'd rather side with Andrei, because I'm not comfortable doing business in Russia now. And publishing business is not part of the monopolization program, but insurers, auditors, construction companies, they are on the verge of extinction in Russia.
Well, it appears that we're living in two parallel universes. Well, I believe that Vladimir Mao needs to think hard about getting an insurance policy for all the forum's participants against mental disorders caused by the 3 days of discussion. So I'd like to ask Alexander Valery Fedorov to speak his mind. So the greatest, the hugest publishing house, Prosvещение or Enlightenment, publishing, specializing in textbooks. So they have the greatest budget, and they announced recently that Mr. Berg stopped being the CEO of that publishing house. It has nothing to do with what they do. They publish great textbooks, and whatever has to do with education and publishing textbooks and methodological guides. So these things are licensed, and they need to be, in my view. I think that we have enough stories in the market, stories of fraud. But, feeling yourself, construing yourself as a global entity has a profound effect. Once you start thinking why would you only build the things in Sochi or in Moscow? Why can't you build things in Dubai or New York? There are lots of people. Same people live there, same type of bricks and so on. So that's what I was thinking in terms of. So if I tried to think about what I need to do, whether I should fight for the government money, for a share of the government money, or I should rather build relationships with teachers and people who know how to do training on a global scale. So that's what our discussion is all about, if we think about it. So Andrei, you have the floor, and then I'll ask for more comments on this discrepancy of opinion. So indeed, we are talking about two different issues that lie on two different planes. In this Chinese opera that governing Russia is, everybody has their own part. People who are working to expand her capabilities, I'm also part of this picture. I have a role to play in this opera, and my business is largely outside of Russia. And they cannot come and say that resource-based economy everything is fine there. But statistics is a horrible thing. The key question is not what you believe in, but what you get. And, it doesn't mean to say that statistics are meaningless, but the greatest catastrophe that has to do with statistics is the Challenger catastrophe, because statisticians misinterpreted the results of tests. And this catastrophe and with interpretations of what's going on in the country is in the same field, in the same cognitive domain. We need to consider the social aspects. Ali Kalpirovich is here, Evgeny is here, and another entrepreneur in the half are sitting here, but we number 146 million people. If I go out, I can find thousands of other entrepreneurs. So the difference between a successful entrepreneur and an unsuccessful one is small. Donald Trump's grandfather sold shovels in Yukon, and he became rich. Was he a successful entrepreneur? I'm not sure, because a lot of people died there. And in Russia, are there entrepreneurs in Russia? Yes, there are, and in Zimbabwe too. So we need to look at the statistical data from a different perspective. Thousands of people are involved in business, only 0.1% are successful. This number is true for many other countries. So in the United States, the level of trust is 20%. So what? So we need to evaluate those factors that we really need to assess. So Nabiullina is saying that we have come out of the crisis. So she says, so we have. But if the oil price of oil drops, then we'll be in crisis again. What Nabiullina has nothing to do, I mean, she doesn't, her business is not perceptions. Her business is to state what the current situation is. So, Andrei, I suggest that we stop here. And Valery, your opinion? Well, after such a flow of conscience, I would rather keep my mouth shut. But I'll say a couple of words anyway. You know, in any market there are bulls and there are bears. Well, some people are short. These people are not bears, are not loved much, but they are needed for creative destruction. So discrepant opinions are a good thing. As regards the context and whether it is important to know what regular people think about entrepreneurship. In my view, their opinion is important because any work would be easier thanks to, but not in spite of. So if you want to go somewhere, we had this example about a U.S. guard, a guard in the U.S. and in a guard in Russia. It's easier to be there when you are asked, how can I help you, instead of why are you here, who do you want to see. So I think context is important because it can either be promoting you, helping you along, or it can be in your way. Well, in some cases it can be a necessary condition, but in many cases other conditions are needed as well. But any businessman, any entrepreneur who you would talk with knows that if everybody around you hate you and believe you are a parasite, that you are a corrupted, deeply corrupted person, then working in such a climate is really difficult, even if you are a super optimist. So my good news, my bit of good news is that we are no longer in this situation. This is not a barrier anymore that is in the way of businesses. Other barriers are more significant. More questions, please. Well, everybody, my name is Alexander Borisov from the Moscow International Legal Association. Frank, I'm sure, knows that about 100 years ago, Otto von Bismarck said that the state can only be governed with good bureaucrats and bad laws. So if the bureaucrats are bad, then even good laws won't help. So it sounds like a call on all of us. So it was more of a comment than a question. So the question about toxic press, toxic media. My question goes to Mr. Fedorov. Did you ever want to poll about 800,000 small businessmen who had to shut their operations in 2016 because of the sharp rise in taxation and some other administrative things that occurred? Did you ever desire to run a poll on people of why people don't want to do business in Russia? Because they're fearful, because they fear the state, and they fear their lack of protection in legal terms against from the government. Well, we all know that most companies that had to shut down either were so-called businesses. They were just scams when businesses, slice their assets in order to pay less taxes. But, the number or the share of entrepreneurs is a constant. And it has been over the recent few years, so we should not be delusioned here. So, speaking about the investment climate in Russia's region, that are presented, the data on this are presented every year. So if you have any specific information rather than asking rhetorical questions, when will you stop beating your wife? So then we need to get down to more specific things. So next question. I come from Perm University. My name is Vladimir Polikov. I'd like to suggest a new wording for the topic. So entrepreneurship. If we look at the roots of entrepreneurship in Russia, let's turn to our Orthodox religion, to the New Testament, to the message to the Jews. Just be content. Be content with what you have. So if we take this maxim as a guide, then what entrepreneurship are we going to be about? So I'm not happy with this. I think that I'm more of a Protestant now, and not all my assets are in Russia. I am welcome in other business schools in Europe. What's your question? So you see, each person operates in those conditions that they are content with. So if we have this notorious pipe economy, then we won't be able to plant Russian U.S. experiences on the Russian soil. So we may want to take as U.S. companies as models, but the reverse will never be true. So what's your question? My question is, how do you want to tackle the problems that we are facing? So I'm going to ask Sergei Medvedev to be part of this discussion. I am also interested in this question in light of our discussion of relationships between Orthodox entrepreneurs, and especially before the October Revolution. We had the old ceremony, Christian, so to speak, and they funded the revolution, by the way. I just wanted to say one word in support of St. Paul and his message to the Jews. It's part of the canon. It's part of the Protestant canon as well. Why are you blaming Orthodox Christians here? Those entrepreneurs who believed that they were Orthodox, they were not inferior to Protestant entrepreneurs. Now they are a little bit worse, but the Orthodox Church is also in decline right now. Religion can never replace institutions. In the United States, they created their institutions in parallel with religious institutions, so we should not mix these two up. Well, the New Testament is the New Testament to everybody, for both Orthodox and Catholics and the Protestants. But here on our panel we have two people who live not just in the world of economics, but they also live in other worlds and in other dimensions. And I'd like to say that I have Ivan Zhitinyov, who is a striber from St. Pete, who makes dischargers or rather thunder protection devices that are used not only in Russia but also in a lot of other markets in China, Latin America, and so on. So he is an innovator. And the Sevkabel facility has been supporting the research institute for 20 years, and they provide very good lightning protection devices for overhead power transmission lines and so on. So all these things exist. But as regards Orthodox Christians, the old school ones, indeed, they are in a way Russian Protestants, because these ideas that we can save our souls individually rather than collectively, I think that these ideas have been around for a while, for several centuries, in the Moscow princedom, and other historic entities. So whatever was retained by the Russian Orthodox Church, the idea of responsibility before the society, and the Protestant idea, Frank being a German, in the preamble to the German Constitution, it's said that property makes you responsible. So indeed, this is something that in Russia, that property gives you more rights. But in other schools of thought, property is more responsibility than rights and privileges. So in your communication with the society, the idea of being austere was rather strong, especially before the revolution, although of course there were lots of currents, lots of schools, analytics, and so on. Indeed, some of them supported Bolsheviks in their efforts. So again, I'd like to get back to you all with a call to build institutions. Religion is an interesting thing. You know, the rut is in our heads. It's not, let's take China. If we take Confucianism, some time back, Confucianism killed Chinese capitalism. Why China started to go down in the 15th century and Europe started to rise? Thanks to Protestants, thanks to the Reformation. Because in Europe they had this code of ethics that supported the institutions, the emerging institutions, the nascent institutions that were just started to grow there. At the same time, Confucian dogma of content, of not competing, and so on, all this helped take down Chinese capitalism. They banned navigation. They didn't make much use of the compass that they had invented. So they had paper money and so on. So read Marco Polo. He visited China in the 12th century, and China at that time was very similar to the 19th century Europe. But then all this was left without use and a long period of national shame. And when China started to rise again, they took the same Confucian values, and Deng Xiaoping started to combine them with pragmatics. It's good to be rich, and it's okay to be rich. And we can see that the same Confucianism can work both ways if it's supported by political will that wants to create institutions. So, colleagues, unfortunately, we are out of time. I would like to thank the audience for their active attention and the speakers for their wonderful presentations. Thank you.